Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll give just another minute or so to let folks join the webinar, and then we will dive right in. Okay, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kariana Barr. I'm the Director of Development and Communications here for the National Homelessness Law Center. So we'll cover just a little bit of housekeeping and then get started with all of our great speakers. So we'll have a couple chances for the speakers to show some slides and do a little bit of presenting, and then we'll have lots of time for Q&A. Just think of, submit all your questions as you think of them, and we will have time for that at the end. So thank you so much for joining Reframing the Conversation, offensive and defensive communications in the time of COVID, and so much else going on in the world. So I am joined today by Anna Kim of Community Solutions, James Dura of Miriam's Kitchen, which is a local nonprofit here in DC, and Eric Falcaro of Street Sense Media. So a little bit of housekeeping. So if you have questions, we would love, for you to submit questions that we can pose to all of our panelists later on. But also, please use the chat function to speak with each other. You can message us or any of the speakers, or message the entire audience. Please keep the conversation going in chat and social media. And then we will, of course, have a recording of this webinar. It will be available on YouTube. It should be up tomorrow, so keep an eye on that. It'll be on our website as well. So without further ado, I will kick it off, get us started with Eric Falcaro of Street Sense Media.
Thank you very much, Kariana. Share my slides here. All right, so when I first got the invitation to join this conversation, which I very much appreciate the opportunity to do so, I was a little thrown off by the topic. I had a pretty narrow view of offensive and defensive communications, thinking mostly about proactive sort of campaign strategy, marketing, or sort of PR efforts to respond in a crisis and sort of defend the reputation of an organization. But when giving it more thought, we're in this incredible moment when journalism as a field is under attack, and so I'm thinking of this more as accurate and trustworthy communications in the time of COVID. In an era where we have to work to sort of propagate and defend basic facts, and when a lot of misinformation is being spread overall. So that sort of falls into two buckets for me. One is for folks who are providing information directly to the public, like we strive to do at Street Sense Media through the journalism, opinion, and art that we produce, as well as that many nonprofits and organizations are trying to do. You know, everyone has a platform. So some of the things that I think are important to keep in mind, to remember, are to use data responsibly, to build trust, and to serve the good of informing people, not just in pushing forward an agenda, and to show things in a way that you can provide adequate context. An example I gave here was an infographic we did last year, in that we took a look at what the point-in-time count found for the number of homeless youth in DC, folks 18 to 24 years old, and compared it to DC government's own youth count, where they take a week instead of a day to do the count, and work a lot more to engage folks and build trust. And some of the things that we took very seriously when putting this together is we had to explain the definitions and that process, because that's what it came down to, is who's included in the count and who's not. But we also had to just put the information side by side correctly. We had to use the same scale for the graphs, so you could see the difference very easily. Even coming down to using the same color for the various categories, so people just quickly and correctly understand what you're presenting to them. Another thing, which is up for debate among many newsrooms, but is to call out misinformation, and to do so where you see it. So the quickest example I could grab visually was this tweet, questioning the integrity of the elections, and that Twitter as a platform decided to at least put a disclaimer saying, get the facts. This might not be accurate. But I use that to say that if your organization sees something, whether it's about COVID, whether it's about homelessness, whether it's about you, that is incorrect, if you don't respond to it, that item exists in a vacuum, and if no one else is seeing it questioned, can be taken as fact. So it's a matter of engaging on social media and responding to the tweet, so that your comment is always there with it. It's up to each organization strategy, and folks in particular, whether you also maybe quote tweet that and provide further context yourself, because then you're also propagating the original claim to begin with. So it's questionable how you move forward from there, but you should always respond, whether it's in a comment section, whether if it's in a publication, if someone prints something that you think is inaccurate or out of context, respond, try and publish an opinion piece, reach out to the editors. Wherever that information is being misrepresented, you should be there and be part of that conversation as well. And it can get a little messy, but that's the work that needs to be done. And all of these efforts are about showing, both sort of policing information and making sure public information is accurate, correcting as needed, but also about building trust. And one of the biggest ways you can do that is also just showing that you hold yourself to the same standard. So this is just a screenshot of a correction that we ran. So it was an article that we learned after we printed it that photos we had featured were slightly out of date, that some repairs had been made to a apartment where the housing had not been maintained well. And so the photos we showed were no longer current. It had only been repaired like a matter of days beforehand, but still that was wrong and misrepresentative. So we, of course, ran a note in our next edition of the paper. We added a correction note to the story and updated it accordingly. But we also ran it on social media, because no matter what you do, you're not going to, if you publish false information, you're never going to reach everyone who consumed it to correct it. But you should try. You should use as many communication channels are available to you. And whether it's someone who consumed that story or not, just saying that you're willing to admit that you're wrong and that you're putting in the work to make it right and to convey accurate information is going to show folks that they should trust what you have to say, and that they should stick with you as a reliable source of information. And this goes back to sort of the tweet example I gave earlier, though when I refer to trolls, we're of course thinking more about comments. And there's a great example from Trusting News here about someone attacking the language used to describe the more or less sort of feel-good story about what this girl is doing. And no matter how ridiculous a comment may be, it doesn't do any good to just ignore it, because the message, the unspoken message that sends to anyone else who comes to your post and sees those comments is that either you don't care enough to speak out, or that what they say has some semblance of truth to it. So it takes some grace and care and thoughtfulness, but you should always be responding to comments and engaging in conversation. Don't assume that a post, a story, whatever the case may be, sort of speaks for itself. Especially, so many people skim a story or only read the headline, only see the social media preview or whatnot. So it really matters to engage with folks, be responsive with folks, and put in the time that it takes to do that, and to stay involved with what you communicate beyond the initial release of information. So another thing is to do your homework, do your research, and be familiar with what you're talking about in a way that you can quickly call on things that add context. Examples here of studies that we've cited off more to I pulled it on the screen. So the study report that the DC Institute put together that looked at half of its thousands. I think it was, the dates are here, I think it's 2002 to 2013, in a decade, losing half of our affordable housing stock. While that is a little dated of a report at this in 2020, that history doesn't change. So that's a very illustrative fact that we can use to show the state of affordable housing in the district. Things might have changed, we might need to add to it, but that's something that we can call on quickly. So we refer back to it a lot. And just being familiar with that report's existence, being able to link to it is helpful, whether you're bringing it into a discussion on social media, whether you're including it in a background paragraph in a news report. But just having those detailed things on hand that you can quickly share without without doing much more is a good way that if you are communicating quickly in a crisis, you can fall back on that larger context in history and get into some of the more systemic issues that crop up and bubble up to the surface in current events. It's just being really familiar with that kind of information and able to share it quickly. The other example here is a report that the first director of the DC Commission on African and American Affairs put together, just comparing housing and employment disparity and inequality amongst white folks and black folks in DC. There's a lot of data points there, and it pulls from a lot of other stories, but that collection is a great synthesized bit of data and really clear narrative that you can quickly direct someone to bring in what is a lot of information, but may need to be shared in a very small space. And another thing in this, bring up racial equality, given everything that's been going on this year and how so many people are paying more attention to interrogating privilege and inequality. But this applies to not just racial inequality. The point, though, is to always bring things back to the systemic issues at hand. And again, this is the infographic here is from the National Alliance, and it clearly communicates what a lot of other people are saying and relying on. But just being able to quickly, in a very easy to understand way, show and remind people about, in this case, the fact that Black Americans make up, I should have checked it before this call, but I think it's 13% of the general population. And in DC make up 80 to 90% of the homeless population, whether you're talking about families or individuals. And something Street Sense Media does uniquely is, we publish both news and opinion and art. All of our art comes from people who are currently or formerly homeless. So the example I gave you on the screen is a poem by one of our contributors, who's also a very active advocate in local DC. And, he connected the most recent Black Lives Matter protests back to housing, the Black Homes Matter too. So always maintaining that focus on the systemic issues at hand is important, and finding ways to be able to address this very complex issue quickly, and what you do is key. And color of law and all explaining redlining doesn't fit into a tweet when you're trying to address the repeal of the Affirmatively Affording Fair Housing Act. But if you have at your disposal and pre-prepared a list of news reports, studies, et cetera, infographics that you can quickly marshal if that's a subject that you're having to dive into, that makes your job a lot easier. And something that we try and remember and always do for our readers is to empower people consuming your communication, your information, both with tools and with a little bit of information. So the two examples of our reporting that I brought up here was one, we put together a story just about the funds that are still available to help folks with housing assistance during the pandemic. It came up in a council roundtable that officials were surprised that those funds hadn't been exhausted. They assumed that it wouldn't be enough, and folks we spoke to said it certainly won't be. And there were a lot of complex issues to unpack about why people are probably holding out until things get a little bit worse, because there's limitations on how often you can apply and all those things. But we made sure to include, while getting into all those details, we made sure to include, this is where you go to apply. This is the information you have to do so. This is who qualifies, so that the people that are in most need, when they finish this article, and we use some subheadings and things to break it up. It's very easy to skim and to navigate, and then remember still just try and remember empower who's a decision maker, but ultimately to show readers what they can do, not just what is being done or needs to be done, but what you as a private individual who may not have any influence over these things, or at least may not think you do, what can be done. So this example here was of a mutual aid effort. So this one person tried to donate some clothes to a women's shelter, spoke to the residents there, realized donations weren't making it to the residents, realized that a lot more was needed. Folks didn't have clothes that fit, didn't have enough food, etc., and marshaled her personal network to get all these things together and started setting up a table regularly to distribute them. So obviously that it's going sort of above and beyond, but shows that you can and should sometimes, if that's what they need, and that other people are. We linked to the DC Mutual Aid Facebook group and a spreadsheet that had contact information for all the various mutual aid groups. So again, giving people the tools and showing that, whether it's in this case sort of raising and creating an effort on your own, might be that you have the opportunity to volunteer, that these are the things that are important to vote on, giving people the tools and the vision for how they can be involved, not calling them to vote a certain way or to go volunteer with this specific organization, but showing that this is what some people are doing and this is how it is effective. And the last thing that we always try and keep in mind with our own communications is to never build up people to be more than they are, to never make them a champion of what you're communicating about, or to insinuate that they're representative of more than just themselves. Yeah, that's different when you're talking to a CEO or something like that. But when you're featuring, for instance, people with lived experience of homelessness, they are certainly an example of what can happen to a person experiencing homelessness, of what can lead someone to experiencing homelessness, etc. But they don't speak for that full community, and they shouldn't be represented as if they do. What we try to do most is to talk to as many people as possible and share multiple stories close together. But we also, if we can't do that, we also try and show data that both supports their experience, but also data that shows that that's not the only experience. It depends on the situation, what you can do, but trying to remember that one person doesn't speak for everyone, and to make sure your audience understands that. And then to also remember, just specifically with the homeless community, that they should, people experiencing homelessness should be treated like anyone else that you're dealing with, for whether it's for a news story or for a campaign that you're creating, giving them the giving is the wrong word, remembering that folks have their autonomy and their things that are important to them as far as how they're being represented. So trying, if possible, to schedule when you're going to see somebody, to give them sort of some input on how you're going to take the photo that you're going to take. Going back over what they've said to make sure everything that you're going to include in your very public communications is something they're okay with putting out there. Treating people that may be in a more vulnerable situation just as you would treat anybody else. And so another example to that point I gave here, these are two images that we included in a story we did earlier this year, where a couple was given a Airbnb for the night, just to be able to wash some clothes, get a shower, have a good night's sleep. They lived in a tent near DuPont Circle, and all of their things were trashed, were stolen, were put in a truck and taken away while they were in that Airbnb. So we went over, took some photos of their tent, their new tent. No one was around at the time. We tried to get in touch for taking photos with them, but ultimately, they sent us this photo that's here on the left of showing them at a better, more positive moment. So even though we're talking about tents and trash, and we're focusing on their humanity. And another thing that I put this sort of in the column of data, but another thing that we showed here was a screenshot of a neighborhood forum on the Nextdoor app, so that we weren't just quoting how someone was talking about these individuals, but we were showing that in conversation, in context, how it was brought up. So it building trust a little bit, so that you're not just having to assume that we're treating the comments fairly. Treating it like a public record, almost showing folks what we're dealing with, not just making a claim. Those are two of the examples I wanted to give there. And to the point I already made, remembering that we're talking almost always about communities, not individuals. So just making sure to go out of your way to fairly and accurately represent that in whatever it is that you're communicating. I believe I'm running up, if not over on time, so I'll end with two thoughts about empathy. So we, humans are, and this came up a lot in the previous Law Center webinar on communications, which I recommend you check out. But humans are hardwired to remember story. It's the most effective thing you can use when, whether for a campaign or whether trying to illustrate and show a situation that you're reporting on in journalism. But what sharing those stories and focusing so much on people does, and you always want to humanize things, but the more you share about someone's story and potentially, for example, how they became homeless, the more you open them up for the person that's consuming that information to question, what could have been done differently, and to think about, well, okay, I understand that the situation they're in is bad, but to forget that this could happen to anybody, and to think more about what could have been different for that person as opposed to what needs to change systemically. And there's a growing body of research. This particular journalist just argues more for showing commonalities between the situations that your readers or donors or whoever may be in with the people that you're highlighting, and especially how, as I'm sure everyone tuning into this knows, that it's cheaper to just house people and deliver less emergency services than it is to respond in the ways that so many jurisdictions do now to people experiencing homelessness. To remind folks of the solidarity, both in their shared humanity, but also in the economic and market forces that sort of tie us all together. And there's a second growing body of research and work where these three journalists in particular start to question what the changing way that we consume media, how that changes the effectiveness of empathy. So what we know about empathy is that it takes time to build. Just because you know someone's story and you see someone's story doesn't mean that you feel how the same things that they're going through. So through a long form article, you're going to build empathy if the story is told correctly. So you're going to be focused on those experiences and really contemplating them. But if you watch a 2-minute video on Facebook, well, you're going to feel things more because you're using more senses and you're digesting more information more quickly. You're not going to internalize that in a way that you necessarily empathize because you're not just putting in the time for that kind of emotional labor. So just continuing to question what we share and how we share it as communications continue to evolve is crucial. And I'll end things there for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. Really, really fantastic content, and is absolutely relevant, both for from a media perspective in terms of, what we need to know, those of us who are working in communication shops, what we need to know for engaging with the media, but also it is really, really relevant for us as well. So to give a little bit of, a little bit of a segue. So, we thought about this topic because, everything is moving so fast. That's happening more and more. And also there's just been a lot of things, different factors bringing homelessness into even more media attention, including COVID-19. Thankfully, it has brought a lot of the inequities of housing to the forefront, and people are thinking about and actually taking into consideration people who are experiencing homelessness, whether sheltered or unsheltered. And at the same time, we also have a federal administration that over the past year or so has been very vocal about homelessness and, the kind of narrative that they get to spin. So I wanted to start by kind of looking at a couple of things that we hear, the type of narratives and the type of language that we hear that we have to respond to. So these are different quotes from the administration. Some of them are directly from President Trump. Some of them are from Carson and some of the agencies, as well as USICH, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. So, these are some of the things that we hear, to misconstrue. Affected cities are usually sanctuary cities run by very liberal people. And this is talking about affected cities being cities with high populations of people experiencing homelessness. And this is just the language that's used to make something that isn't political. And then you have language that is just weird rhetoric, to use humane policing. This is something that the Law Center is always thinking about, but just because we try to focus and really bring attention to the criminalization of homelessness. And so, what is humane policing? What does that even mean? Also, we've heard and had to respond to the idea that people are too comfortable on the street, or that overregulation of the housing market is the main cause of homelessness. And these are just some of the examples of, the type of language and the type of communications that we are playing defense against, that we are responding to. Next slide. And then getting even more, this is from the director of the USACH. Marbet has said, kind of more double speak. It's using, he's propagated using transformative systems for self-sufficiency. And it's like, oh, well, that sounds good. But what does that really mean? And then he's also kind of spun one of, something that narrative and language that we use, housing first. He's spun that to imply that housing first means housing only, that's the only solution. And he spins that to kind of fit his preferred methodology, I'll say. He also says that he believes that criminalization is wrong, but then also, uses terms like using a velvet hammer, and that you have to reward positive behavior, and uses a lot of kind of, carrot and stick rhetoric that seems to counter a little bit the claim that the belief is actually criminalization is wrong. So just some things to mull on. And then what is the actual strategy that we take against all this? And this, I am a complete geek about the rhetorical appeals. This is, goes back to Aristotle, but the ethos, pathos, and logos. And as my job, both as a fundraiser and doing our both marketing and PR, both proactive and reactive, I really focus on the emotion and the logic, the pathos and the logo. And typically, actually, you can go to the next slide. Oops. Keep going. Sorry. There we go. I found this great quote from the cause agency, and this is really specific to fundraising, but it kind of talks about, you do use logos and you use pathos when you're talking to different audiences. And typically when I'm looking at, when we're looking at fundraising, my kind of go-to is about 50-50 in our, fundraising and kind of our general communications. Next slide. But then there's also different times. And so this is kind of what I was thinking about with, playing offense versus defense. It's the proactive communications versus the reactive communications. And just this is entirely just kind of what my preferences and what we tend to do at the law center. But typically, it's always going to be a combination of that pathos and logos. But playing offense, we're more likely to use data and facts. Because so much of our proactive communications are going to our existing audiences. So there's going to audiences that already have some amount of belief in what we're saying, in our mission, in our values. Their beliefs align with us a little bit. But, these might not get as much attention because they're going to kind of our existing audiences. On the other hand, we have the defensive, the really reactive communications. These, I actually think using more of the emotional appeal can be really meaningful because you're focusing not on your existing audience, but on the original communicator's audience. You're trying to reach that person. And I think for the people who, aren't totally invested in your work or what you're trying to get across, using the stories and emotional appeal, and just, to Eric's point, this can be really effective. But something that we've been thinking about, kind of struggling with, is, how do you balance that? How are you constantly defending against bad rhetoric without coming off as, desperate or untrustworthy? People have, have their own beliefs about, who gets the first word, and then who is fighting against that. So you have to manage that as well and make sure that you're not harming your own credibility by playing defense in the wrong way or too much. So that's something that we're thinking about as well. And next. Perfect. So that was just a little bit of information kind of that I wanted to share, and kind of as a segue as we're thinking about, both from the media side and for what does this mean, what do these communications mean for those of us who are actually living and working in this every day. So just kind of the high, 3,000 level or 3,000 foot high view. And now I will turn it over to Anna Kim, who I know is going to go into a lot more detail and really specific examples of what this looks like in practice. So Anna, I will turn that over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Let me just get this. Oops. All right. So thank you so much, Kariana and Eric, and happy to be with you, James. So as Kariana mentioned, my name is Anna Kim, and I'm the Principal of Communications and Campaigns at Community Solutions. I'm also going to be drawing on some experiences and learnings that I've gleaned from some previous roles. I used to be the Director of Communications at a public defender office in the South Bronx called the Bronx Defenders. And there we found ourselves doing a lot of sort of reactive communications or finding ourselves in a defensive posture. So I'll be pulling some learning from both of these experiences. I'll be hoping to touch on 3 elements of developing and executing a strategy. First is the framework that we've been using to sort of guide the core pillars of our communication strategy. And then I'm hoping to share with you some frameworks and tools that have helped us really articulate and design that strategy. And then finally, some resources that we found super helpful in measuring and learning what's actually working. A little bit of background, Community Solutions is a nonprofit that leads Built for Zero, which is a national initiative of more than 80 cities and counties across the country working to measurably end homelessness. We're also working in coalition with all of these organizations that find ourselves in need of a lot of sort of both affirmative and defensive communications these days. So I'm going to start off with this framework that I mentioned earlier, which really helps us answer the key questions of what is the problem that we are trying to solve. When we are looking at an inciting sort of event or something that we are anticipating, we really start usually with the scenarios. What is the communications outcome that we want to be prepared for or mitigate against? And these are just placeholders that we've actually used recently. So this doesn't have to be the one that you find yourself in. But when we were looking at a particular event, there were 3 scenarios, 3 comms outcomes that we were looking at. One was that the opposing force was not going to get really any media traction, but that whatever they were announcing was going to be exploited by key stakeholders. The second scenario was that what they were going to announce was going to get traction in particular spheres of influence, whether that's partisan media or sector-specific media. And the last one, which I think is oftentimes the worst comms outcome that we're looking at when we're looking at crisis communications, is widespread traction of the opposing view. Being able to map out these scenarios in our head just allows us to be ready for whatever the most appropriate strategy might be and what that will require of us. The next question that we ask ourselves is, what is the harm that we're trying to prevent or mitigate, and who is going to be harmed? As advocates or communicators, I think we're always operating by this principle of doing no harm, and we also recognize that even well-intentioned affirmative communications can sometimes advance harm. So it's really important that we ask ourselves these questions so we understand who we need to be engaging, who do we need to be partnering with, who do we need to be centering as we're developing this strategy. The next question we usually ask ourselves is, what is the strategy of this opposing actor, right? Who are they appealing to, and what is the behavior or action that they are seeking to produce? And that can look really different, right? Depending on what the scenario looks like. If they're trying to go for mass appeal, then that is a whole different audience than if they're really targeting, say, people specific in their field. The next question we're usually asking ourselves is, who do we need to target as our audience? And what is the desired behavior that we are trying to drive? And sometimes it's the case that their audience and our audience is exactly the same. And so what our strategy really needs to look like is persuading the same people who are receiving sort of contradicting messages to believe something different. But we found that it's also the case that sometimes we're actually trying to mobilize not a completely different audience, but a very particular audience. So it may be the case that they are appealing to people of special interest who are inclined to, adopt their views. And we have people that are with us. And what we really need to focus on is galvanizing and equipping those people with the right tools and the messages so that they can go out and sort of advocate for whatever it is our point of view or our solution or our policy is. I think being able to map out who you're targeting is really, really important, because sometimes if you don't, you can end up sort of trying to boil the whole ocean, and you're not really executing the most effective strategy that's targeted to the people that you're most likely to reach and galvanize. And then the last thing, once we've answered these three subsets of questions, we start to think about what are the tactics. And this is where I'm really grateful to come after Eric, because I think he's really sort of demonstrated sort of what the power of media can look like, what the power of art, what the power of all of these different levers can be. And so I think this is at the, once we've understood what the strategy is, we can start asking ourselves, who do we need to partner with? Do we need to be employing earned media, social media, and influencer strategy? Is it storytelling? What do we need in our toolkit? The other thing that I want to note is that I think that we are trying to shift into a sort of posture where when things happen, we're not just thinking about it as an immediate crisis for us to react to, but understanding that it is a symptom of a chronic problem. And as people working to end homelessness, we know that this is particularly true, that when we're responding to a really harmful policy or really harmful narratives that are being pushed by detractors or opposing parties, they are all really exploiting problems that have always existed. They may be new policies, but it's not a new problem. And so one of those threads, for example, is that we find that oftentimes the narrative is about really blaming individuals who are experiencing homelessness, right? And we see this reflected in public polling. We see this reflected in public perception research. This is driven by a whole host of things, from racism to pathologizing poverty. So this is something that we need to be aware of and have an affirmative strategy to address all year round. And we need to also use these moments to really push back on these issues. The other chronic problem that we also are sort of bumping up against at all times is that there might be a lack of public confidence when it comes to solutions about ending homelessness, or the progress that's actually happening in different communities, or that has even been driven nationally. And what this enables opposing parties to do is to really incorrectly prescribe, quote unquote solutions that we know are not actually going to translate into the meaningful results that we need to see for folks who are experiencing homelessness. So whenever we find ourselves in a situation where we're responding to a crisis, I think there are a few questions that we can ask ourselves so that we're ready sort of for the long haul, right? And we're starting to change sort of the tides that enable this to happen. So what are the narratives that have primed the ground for these threats to emerge, right? And what communications infrastructure needs to be shored up so that we are ready to respond and start to affirmatively change the narrative? Who are the messengers that we have on our bench? What are the tools that we should have on hand for media? I think Eric mentioned like fact sheets and data. Who are the coalition of partners that we should be working with? And ultimately, how can we be prepared to turn these moments that elicit a defensive posture or reactive communications into an opportunity for us to be pushing what our proactive affirmative messages really are? I know that developing core messaging is hard, and I think as communicators is something that you're constantly struggling, right? It is an art and a science. And so I wanted to share a couple frameworks and tools that we've used and we're constantly using to iterate upon the messaging that we're developing here at Community Solutions. We know there's three things that you have to know to develop your core messages. One is yourself, like what do you actually think? Know your audience and what are they hearing, and then know your detractors. I've adapted this template from the opportunity agenda, which we found so helpful. One, it starts with this pillar of defining the end state, right? Being able to clearly articulate what it is the world that we're trying to create looks like. And so that people can see themselves in it and sort of understand what you're driving towards. The second is defining the problem. And I think with homelessness, and I'm sure other issues as well for folks who are, working on different social issues, you can often get mired into a debate over the problem. And I think that's often what happens with homelessness, because people just have fundamental different opinions about what this issue is really about. And so we need to be really, really clear up top that this is a structural issue, a systemic issue, a result of bad policy, a result of racism. We need to be really clear about that. We need to be able to pivot to solvability and solutions, so they're not just always attacking policies that are wrong, but able to, in that place, provide what we know the vision and the solution actually needs to look like. And then finally, we need to be able to connect that to why people should care. And I think Eric provided some really helpful tips there about how you really connect this to individual stories. This is another framework that we've used that's been really helpful, because I think that sometimes there is a risk when you're working in a field to get really locked into the way that you all communicate about the issue, or the people that are with you communicate about the issue. And this has helped us understand what is the full universe of messaging that anyone is consuming about your issue. And so in this upper left quadrant, you'll see like what we say about us. And I think that's really what I've mentioned in these previous slides about like, what is our view on the problem, the solution, what needs to happen. And then you'll see on the right, to the right of that is like, what do they say about us, right? So what are the common rebuttals that folks are sort of standing up against how you view the world? In the lower right, you'll see what do they say about them? Like, what is their worldview, and how are folks advocating and convincing people that their point of view is correct? And then finally, in the lower left, you'll see what do we say about them? How are we ready to rebut how sort of these opposing forces might be framing the issue or the solution? And so we found this to be a really helpful exercise, just to sort of get us out of just what do we want to say, but also what do we need to be ready to respond to? And this is just a framework that we've used, where essentially we have our goal up top, the top line messages, and then sort of supporting facts, stats, and stories that we have ready to go, so that everyone is sort of equipped with the core messaging to go out there and be advocates for the work. And then I'm going to try to wrap up really quickly, because I think I might be over. But I wanted to make sure I shared this resource that we've been using that has been super helpful. It's called Usability Hub, and I became familiar with it when I used to work for another organization that developed technology to support sexual assault survivors. But the web designers were using this to sort of iterate on the tool to make sure it was really user-centered. And it's not free, but it's fairly cost-effective when you compare it to something like focus groups. And what you can do is you can set demographics and set up like surveys and like tests and all sorts of things, and send them out to folks and get really, really quick iterative feedback. It's obviously not a replacement for the deep and intentional, I'm sure, testing and thinking that you all are constantly doing about messaging, but we found that it's a really, really good tool to have sort of in our tool belt for just really, really quick feedback. And just to give you an example, when I first came into Community Solutions, I used it to better understand how people were responding to how we talked about our work. And two things became really, really clear. One, that we were not being clear about what we were doing. They didn't like our several long sentences that don't actually describe what we do. And also, I think that probably many of you could relate, is that there was a really fundamental lack of belief in what we were doing, because we worked to end homelessness. And so just wanted to make sure that I shared that tool with you all in case that might be a helpful resource.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate that, Anna. And then we will move to Q&A here in a few, but James, do you just want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about Miriam's Kitchen and your role there?
Yes, I'd love to. So hi, everybody. I'm James Dura. I am Director of Communications at Miriam's Kitchen, nonprofit in Washington, D.C., dedicated to ending chronic homelessness. And Cariana, did you want me to go into just how we stay on the offense, or are we going back to you and then coming back to me?
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. So we're talking about how to stay on the offense as it relates to navigating media and all of those kind of things. So I wanted to come and really talk to local and startup nonprofits and organizations who a lot of times they wonder how they can remain on the offense as it relates to navigating media and developing messaging that protects and propels their organizations. And I mentioned, local and startups because a lot of those kinds of organizations, especially in the times of COVID, struggle with resources. So they don't have a lot of times they don't have the ability to hire, these strategic councils and consultants and have big internal communications teams. So I wanted to talk about these simple yet extremely effective approaches that we all can take, no matter how big or small, but definitely local organizations that they can take to utilize that bring no fiscal that bring no cost as it relates to fiscal resources. And it only requires three things. It requires time, it requires intention, and it requires an authentic approach to the work. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is how we can all develop proper messaging for the state of our work and our nation. What does that mean? Well, it really just means not being tone deaf, and it means it means being able to assert your organization and insert your work into current events in a way that, like I said, is authentic, but in a way that really allows you to raise up what your mission is, and bring it into how it connects with what's happening. And so at Miriam's Kitchen, we are being extremely intentional on three specific messaging points right now that really speak to where we are. So one speaks to taking care of yourself during the pandemic. And that messaging point is really drilling into the fact that housing is healthcare. And that messaging point is so important for us because it really speaks directly to how we need to protect our homeless citizens who are extremely vulnerable during these times. We are able to shelter in place and quarantine in our homes, and our homeless neighbors are not able to do that. So really drilling in where and whenever we can, housing is healthcare, so that it just remains clear during this time that we have work to do there. And also, right now in our country, where we're seeing what I like to call a resurgence of Jim Crow, where there is obscene amounts of police brutality and violence, racial violence is growing and thriving, unfortunately. And so being able to tie our work into racial justice, because what is true is that homelessness disproportionately affects populations of color, and mainly the Black community, who makes up the majority of that population. So being intentional about developing messaging around the fact that what we do to alleviate chronic homelessness directly impacts racial equity. It directly impacts social justice. And then also developing messaging about the fiscal resources that are needed to help organizations like Miriam's Kitchen alleviate chronic homelessness. I know a lot of us, especially us in DC, well, everywhere in the country, really have, heard people talk about defunding the police, which, really means just taking some of those resources and putting them in places that that would really be more impactful for our communities. So to that end, to how we are connecting ourselves to that particular current event is really bringing up ways in which the current DC budget can better address and better support programs and interventions for our homeless citizens, and how they can be expanded to benefit more people, more homeless neighbors. So that's what we're doing as it relates to developing proper messaging that really speaks to where we are in our nation. The next thing that we do, that I suggest everybody do during this time, is just reevaluating reevaluating your engagement with your network and community of supporters. We definitely are taking that into consideration at Miriam's Kitchen. I know, since most of us have been working from home during the pandemic, there's this thing called Zoom fatigue and meeting fatigue. And, most of us are meeting on Zoom every day for most of the day, depending on what your position is. And so the last thing that a lot of us really want to do is further inundate ourselves with that kind of that overstimulation of digital interaction. And so we make sure that we are looking at other ways to digitally interact with people. So what does that look like? Maybe, instead of taking, when we assess the fact that maybe, and this is just a fake number, but let's say Miriam's Kitchen has 10 events that they had planned pre-COVID that were supposed to be in-person events. So instead of converting all 10 of those in-person events to digital events, maybe what we do is try to figure out how we can combine some of those so that we don't contribute to that Zoom fatigue, or figure out a way to turn one of those into a digital fundraising campaign or a digital social media campaign that still garners engagement from people, but doesn't require them to sit in front of their computer screen for an extra hour and a half after they have done that for 8 hours in their day. So doing things like that to really support the people who follow you, really support the people who in turn support you. And so another thing that we are being intentional about is what I said earlier, and that's reevaluating and restructuring our organizational communication activities to ensure that we're not presenting as tone deaf. A lot of communications professionals will tell you that they'll tell you that it's better to keep that upbeat messaging and keep that upbeat persona on your social and in your emails and all of that. But the reality is that we're not in an upbeat world right now. And so what we don't want to do is create this bubble of false positivity. And I think Anna mentioned it earlier. We need to state the issues. We need to state the problems that are happening right now, and really talk about what the solutions to those problems look like. And then another thing that I've already stated is that we don't ignore current events. So it would behoove us to incorporate conversations about voting and about racial equity and about healthcare, and even unfortunately COVID, it makes sense for us to incorporate all of those subjects into what we are saying about our work and how that impacts others. And then the next one here is a biggie for me, and I think for everybody really, is that we want to make sure that as we are restructuring our organizational communications activities to address what's going on, we need to make sure that what we are communicating externally is what we're practicing internally also. You know, when George Floyd was murdered, and when Breonna Taylor was murdered, when all of these things happened, we saw a really big, we saw the workforce really collectively release statements of solidarity for the Black community. And talk about how racial equity is really important to them. But on the flip side, we saw that those same organizations are led by their leadership teams are all white men, or just all white, or they don't have any people of color on their leadership team. And so that really begs the question of what you really doing? Are you really practicing the things that you're saying externally? So you got to make sure your daily interaction with your staff and with prospective candidates for positions at your organization, you got to make sure that that daily interaction is in line with what you're releasing externally. And you got to make sure that your tolerance internally reflects that as well. And to make sure, you got to make sure that your HR practices with your current staff is up to par with what you are saying is the values of your organization. So that's that. And I think the last thing that I want to hit on, because I see that we are we're coming close to time, is proactively working with media to tell our stories our way. And I know that both Eric and Anna mentioned this earlier, but we've got, and I think you too, Carrie, I think you said it too, but we've got to make sure that we're proactively working with media instead of, playing that defense. And the ways in which we are doing that at Miriam's Kitchen is that we're constantly discussing ways that we can create news instead of waiting to become news. I think that once you become news, there's little that you can do to get on the other end of it. That's just my belief. If that's what you do daily. So what we try to do, it's not always possible, but what we try to do is create news. What can we do to bring positive attention to our work, to our mission, to our guests at Miriam's Kitchen? So we're creating news. And then the other thing that we do to play that offensive role, is presenting ourselves as experts who possess that data and that knowledge that the media need in order to accurately report, their stories. So keeping in contact with, your local reporters, producers, and letting them know, hey, we have this data for you. We have experts who specialize in this and that, and we would love to be a resource to you when you produce stories in the following categories. That consistent light pitching, if you will. A lot of us, we talk about how we need to be pitching stories, but sometimes we just need to be pitching ourselves so that the reporters and producers can come to us when it's time to tell stories that have to do with the work that we do every day. So I will stop there, and so that the team can get into the question and answer section.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, James. And that actually, your last point actually kind of feeds into the first question really perfectly, which is, how do we engage with the traditional media, either as allies or as adversaries sometimes? And, for Eric, from his role, what do you think the media's responsibility is as well? So James, you kind of answered that, but is there anything you would add to start us off on that?
Oh, would I add anything to that question?
Yes.
So I think I definitely don't ever want to present myself as an adversary to media, because the truth is that we need them to amplify our stories. So the approach that I always try to take is to become a partner with them and do, like I said, and let them know, hey, I have this raw data for you so that you're able to accurately tell this story, because of the fact that, there are a lot of myths as it relates to homelessness and the causes of homelessness, and those who are survivors of homelessness. So working with them to educate them on those myths and educate them about, what the facts are, so that they aren't spreading what you call fake news and data that might and fake data that might have been widely shared but isn't necessarily real. So I really just try to take that standpoint, if you will, and just let them know that, hey, I'm on your side. I want to help you accurately report the news, and I want to make your job easier. I want to make your job easier, and I want to make it incredibly easy for you to not only tell this story, but to look good. I take that same approach with everything. Like if I make you look good, then you're going to always be on my side of the fence.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Anna, is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, while there are definitely, more friendly reporters and less friendly reporters, I think the way I always think about it is that we're not speaking to the reporters, we're speaking to their audience. So seeing them as a vehicle to a group of people that we definitely want to engage, and also sometimes we're just taking up space because we know it's important for us to be a source to ensure that the right framing or the right points of views are incorporated. So I think it's, while there are certainly more trusted journalists and less trusted, I think we try to understand that it's really their audiences that we're most concerned about reaching.
Great, absolutely. And I would just add too, I think really, yeah, being proactive in reaching out to the media, it can be so beneficial in building relationships. And I have really found too, when you put together a press release that, you can send, I think it's, can sometimes be easy to say, oh, we don't have time to, put out a press release. It's not the biggest fire. But that also becomes, the sound bites that are your social media and can be used kind of as talking points. And, it really, even just that, having the language all put together can be really beneficial for so many reasons in terms of communication. So it really can be worth the time and effort put into it. And then Eric, would you want to add anything just from your perspective in the media?
Yeah, I think that James really hit the nail on the head. I was speaking my language there at the end. In that sourcing is everything to a journalist, and it depend. Some media outlets Street Sense Media is unique in that we get to focus exclusively on homelessness and poverty. At many points, Washington City Paper has had a housing complex columnist, but by and large, there's not always a reporter focused on these issues. And we're talking about, decades of various policies and, new data trends and just so many overlapping complex things that a general assignment reporter jumping into these situations is not going to have that context or understanding. So just from looking at the systemic issues, it's really helpful to get to know someone who can sort of walk you through it because that's their area of expertise. But also with direct service providers or even with advocacy groups that maybe don't work directly with the community, but do go out of their way to empower speakers and folks, sources from the community. Just having someone that can has trust with members of the community that you're working on and could help reach out on your behalf, say like, hey, would you be interested in willing to talk to a reporter and share some of your experience, or invite you to come to some of the services being provided if appropriate. Just that opportunity to sort of trade on your trust in the community to find someone who's knowledgeable, and especially given the pandemic when so many people are working from home, and a lot of, at least in DC, a lot of homeless service providers are trying to keep people from moving around as much as possible, and the usual places are not operating. It's always important to have those relationships and being able to work through your existing relationships to connect to the folks that your audience needs to hear from. But it's especially important now. So just being able to have the relationship with the experts, so when you're responding to a news event, you're trying to wrap your head around a story, you already know who to reach out to, that whether that's James or Anna, or but also being able to work through them to make new relationships. And just thinking back to what you put in a press release that you mentioned, and the concept of a soft pitch, like James mentioned. I get not thousands, but certainly have gotten dozens of press releases in a single day. It's hard to sort of cut through that inbox noise. But when I get a email from the advocacy director at Miriam's Kitchen, I perk up and I make sure to look and read and see what's going on. So making sure to build that relationship so that folks trust you and listen to you. There's no replacing that. It's crucial. And ultimately, it's to the benefit of our audiences, because they're going to be better, more well-informed, because we're able to build those relationships to find the right information and to properly contextualize it and understand it.
Great, fabulous. All right, another question from an attendee that Eric, you mentioned this, but I'm sure can all speak to this. Typically, the attendee asked, or said that typically they ignore the trolls, especially on social media. So your recommendation, Eric, was a little bit of a surprise. Are there any strategies or tips and tricks in how to manage all that? Because sometimes that can be really overwhelming. So how do you prioritize and how do you make time and space to actually respond meaningfully?
So from our standpoint, no one has the time to just get into a never-ending back and forth with someone who is continuing to troll an issue. So I think it depends on what the platform is, because if you have the option to mute or remove someone's comments, if they are absolutely adding no value to the conversation, you don't need to spend your time trying to have a useless debate when the other person is not informed and is spewing nothing but vitriol. So if you have the option to shut down the conversation, if it truly is of no value, then take that road, right? But if someone is referencing misinformation, it's helpful to them and the others thinking but not saying what they're saying to correct the information. So sort of taking that strategic assessment of what are they reacting to, and who could I inform, how could I inform people by responding. And so if they are responding to common misinformation, go ahead and respond and correct it. If they continue to reply, argue no matter what, at some point you have to say, look, I can't continue this with you. I just don't have the bandwidth. But you should say that. Be transparent. Show that for however long you were invested in this conversation, and at some point you had to check out, but you let them know that. You didn't just ghost them, for lack of a better term. And if it's a conversation that it is just based on sort of vitriol and that you can't make a constructive argument because there's nothing to respond to other than emotion, but you cannot mute it or get rid of it. Call it out and make your sort of reasoned response, and provide what resources or facts that other folks that see it may be interested in. But make that your final response. Be transparent there. That there's nothing to argue here, but here's some information you might be interested in. But the big thing is to show up, to show people you're listening, to show them that you respond when appropriate, and to be transparent about when you're not going to and why. So everyone's going to have to triage what they're able to spend time on. But that way of engaging with your audience, you can't put a price tag on that. It's so worthwhile for building trust and remaining not, at least on the journalism side. In the comments is where we'll get story ideas we hadn't even considered, and certainly on the communication side, I would assume that you'd want to maintain some semblance of input and control, if that's the right word, over the narrative that's otherwise existing in a vacuum because this other person has the time to put it there.
Great. Anna or James, anything to add from your experiences?
No, I don't really. I think just plus one to everything Eric said.
No, I don't think I have anything to add to that particular question.
Great. Okay. And then another question, which I think is one that we're all dealing with and thinking about a lot these days. What do you do? What are some strategies for the folks who don't believe the data that you're putting out, or the data doesn't fit into the confirmation bias that they have? How do you manage that? I can go ahead and start. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, you got it.
So I will say, this is something that we constantly have to think about these days. So part of it is, hopefully long term you can develop, trust with folks, and you can have, a strong reputation. But I think you also just, kind of have to recognize when you're just not going to reach someone. I think our hope is that we can get across and change the minds of everyone, but it's not always realistic. And I think, there's different strategies for different people. There's strategies for people who might believe some of what you're talking about, but not everything, or they believe it, but they're not ready to act yet. And then there are the folks who nope, their beliefs are completely different, and you kind of drilling into them, what you want to share can have an adverse effect, can have the boomerang effect of just kind of pushing them deeper into their beliefs. And for us at least, we do tend to focus on the former, the folks who, we think we actually can get to. And, if we could do more, if we had more time and capacity and staff, I'd love to be able to do more messaging to reach those those hard to convince folks, but I think it's just, prioritizing for us. And James, you were going to say?
If you don't mind restating that question for me one more time, please.
Of course. The question was just, what are some strategies or how do you deal with people who aren't necessarily going to believe the data that you are putting out there, or that are just going to be hard to really get across to?
Oh yes. Well, that's a difficult one because as a very practical guy. If someone gives me proof about something, then I just have proof about it, and there's nothing I can do about it. So I don't really know how to combat people who don't know how to adhere to facts and data that is credible. So to that end, when I'm dealing with someone or anybody who doesn't believe the data that I'm putting in front of them, then I honestly just have to move on, and I have to keep telling the truth until someone, picks up on it, because also, like, I look at it as if I'm dealing with, colleagues or members of the media or whoever who don't want to take the data that I'm providing as credible, then that really just means that I probably don't want to work with them anyway. That probably isn't the best mode of visibility that I want to attract, because if they're not taking what I'm saying it's credible when I know that it is, then that probably means that everything else that they're producing is questionable as well. And I think at the end of the day, none of us really want to be associated with outlets or individuals or professionals who have questionable profiles. So, I really don't think there's much to be done when people don't believe facts.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that come to mind. If this is a priority, so I think as James mentioned, like, it's not always worth your time, right? But let's assume that for some reason, like, this is an important person or individual. I think it's helpful to think about, like, what is the source of that skepticism, right? So is the source of the skepticism who the messenger is? So are you just not for whatever reason, are you not a credible messenger to this person or to this group? And are there other people who would be credible messengers? That might be one tactic. Is it the message itself, right? So is the skepticism actually just sort of a misunderstanding? Are there other ways to represent it, whether visually or through storytelling, that are more likely to sort of break through in a way? Again, that is assuming that there's a good faith effort to understand, but it just is a misunderstanding fundamentally about the substance. Or is the source of skepticism really that it is bumping up against a closely held fundamental belief or value of that individual, in which case you're probably not going to be able, or it would be very difficult for you to be able to sort of break through and change their mind. So I think it's helpful to know what the source is, because some of them are solvable by you as a communicator and some of them are not.
And I just build off that, and I certainly co-sign everything that's been said. But from the media perspective, it's a part of our job when we're reporting to corroborate, right? So we always look for ways to back up what someone has told us, to interrogate the validity of a study or a data set that's been given to us, and find where that may have been assessed somewhere else, or get an expert to sort of look at it with us and walk us through it. And I think that can hold true to when you're communicating something directly outside of media, and whether that's getting a few people with direct experience to give you some quotes, lived understanding to go along with the data, whether that's showing that other organizations that have found similar information, but being able to corroborate what this one thing is saying by showing how that's been demonstrated elsewhere, or how that is understood by others. And if it is a completely unique, novel fact, piece of data, then spending some extra time communicating how it was gathered and why you should put faith in it, and being transparent about where the shortcomings are. Yeah, I think that goes a long way in building trust. But as has already been said, it depends on the person and the situation. That you also have to assess whether it's going to be a battle that you can win, or a problem that you can solve to bring them around to understanding it. But I think those tools help.
Absolutely. Great. Well, we are approaching time. We're approaching 3:30. So I just really want to thank you all again for joining us today, and thank you to Eric, Anna, and James for joining us. Hopefully got some good takeaways and some things to think about with our very fast-paced, ever-changing climate of communications and narrative. So thank you all again. And again, a reminder that this will be available on our website. A recording of the full webinar will be on our website and on YouTube later this week. So thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks all.